Our second topic this week is over this concept of economic impact. Now, why might it be important for sport practitioners to know about and be able to calculate economic impact? Well, the concept of economic impact is important not only because it helps us calculate the financial impact of the sporting events we put on as practitioners, but it can also be used as a helpful PR tool if we are looking to, let's say, finance a project or sustain an event over a period of time. Now, not everything that comes out of a sporting event can be measured from an economic perspective, and that complicates things a bit. We also know that economic impact is a key component of a feasibility study. We identified it in our last video lecture. This is an important calculation that, a city or a team would want to calculate before they build a new stadium or move a team, right? Is it a controversial measure? Yes, it definitely is. There are a lot of good things that come out of economic impact studies, and, they've been used successfully in the past to justify sport events or to, push a feasibility study over, the finish line. They can certainly be useful. And they can certainly highlight some of the good things that sport organizations do for local communities that they're housed in. But there's also a lot of controversy surrounding them when it comes to the way the numbers are put together, and it doesn't always provide a clear-cut picture of the actual economic impact. So, it's an important measure to understand, and there are a lot of important pieces for us to look at here. And we're going to focus on, some specific ways you can calculate accurate economic impact or benefit. We'll also highlight some of the kind of concerns or issues with conducting these. Okay, a couple key terms here for us to identify economic impact. Obviously, the title of our lesson here. What is economic impact? Well, it is the net economic change in a community resulting from the spending that can be attributed to a sporting event or facility. Let's focus in on that phrase, net economic change. Okay, net economic change essentially just refers to money that enters a community that would not have otherwise happened if the sporting event did not occur, right? So this net economic change, that is a direct result of a sport facility or event. So you can kind of think of it like a return on investment measure. And one really important thing for us to consider when we're calculating economic impact is not just the money coming in, but also the money going out, right? What was the cost of bringing this particular sporting event to town or constructing this facility? What are the ongoing costs associated with that? So true economic impact is measured when we account for both the money coming in and the money going out. And again, like I mentioned earlier, that's not always the case when these are conducted. Economic impact analysis is basically just a phrase for the studies that are conducted to measure economic impact. Who conducts these? Well, individual sport organizations can conduct their own economic impact analysis. Certainly there could be some bias there, right, if the sports team is conducting its own economic impact analysis. So they could definitely outsource that to a consulting firm that might come in and gather data and present an analysis. There's a lot of scholars working in the field of sport management that work on economic impact analysis studies. So there are ways for teams or cities to outsource these to folks that might have or be a little bit more neutral in their analysis. Okay, this is just a visual I like to show when we're trying to reference economic impact. Again, think of it, this is the city, right? Here's the visitor spending coming into the city as a result of a sporting event that's happening. And here's what's happening as a result, right? Tax dollars are coming in. The hospitality industries are getting money, right, because there's visitor spending. Ultimately, jobs are justified or created from that visitor spending, and all of this is, positive result for the city, right? So if you can measure economic impact and show that a sports facility or event is having a positive impact on that community, that could be a really great justification for bringing a sporting event back. Here locally anyway, the IHSA is, an organization that's consistently seeking to have its events in different places in the state, and Peoria and Bloomington have been kind of two of their major hubs for hosting some of their basketball tournaments. And, in order to do that, the city, and the IHSA sort of have to come to the table and say, we're bringing all these visitors here and it's having a positive impact on the community. And we're going to keep doing that. So that's just one example. Okay, so how do we actually calculate economic impact? Well, first we have to understand and put some things out there in terms of this concept of visitor spending, right? We know that in order to assess economic impact, we're looking at this concept of visitor spending, right? So people that don't live in the community coming into that area and then spending money while they're there. So you have to set a few parameters in order to calculate economic impact. First, you have to set a geographic parameter, right? How far out are we going to go from a particular city to actually gauge visitor spending? I always use the Chicago Marathon as an example, right? Of course, the marathon's happening in the heart of Chicago, but of course, not everyone is staying at a hotel right in Chicago, right? People could be staying out by the airport because it's cheaper. They could be staying in one of the suburbs because it's even cheaper and just taking the train in. So, obviously the committee assessing economic impact for this event would want to set a geographic parameter that accounts for that, right? That accounts for a wider net. Another piece or parameter you'd want to identify is the time period you want to measure. So again, using the marathon as an example, this is from 2019. Here was the schedule, right? So the event started on Friday, Saturday and Sunday was the race day. So there were basically these 3 days that there were, marathon-related events occurring. People starting to check in on Friday and then the actual event on Sunday. So you wouldn't just want to assess spending on that one day, right, the race day. You'd also want to assess spending that occurred from visitors on those other 2 days. So figuring out the time period you want to measure is key. And then finally, defining who you want to assess the spending of, or the type of spending you want to assess. And this gets into our conversation of actually defining what a visitor is. Okay, so before we talk about the different types of visitors, it's important for us to sort of identify the difference between a local and a visitor, right? You're probably like, well, that's pretty obvious, Liz. Don't think we need to do that. But there's a couple of things I want to mention here when it comes to locals versus visitor spending when we're looking at economic impact. So we don't want to look at local spending in the same way that we look at visitor spending because of this concept of displaced spending, right? If a local who lives in the Chicago area comes down to the marathon, goes out to eat at a restaurant the night before the race and, does some other spending locally while the race is happening, that's not the same as visitor spending, right? Because that local probably would have gone out to eat in the area and spent that money that they were going to spend anyway, right? So that's why if we were to look at that local spending when we're calculating economic impact, it wouldn't be a true measure, right? Because like we said back here when we introduced the term economic impact, we want to see the net economic change that resulted from spending. And if we're looking at local spending, that's not really assessing change, right? Because that spending was going to occur anyway in some capacity. All right, so let's identify the different types of visitors because we're going to classify visitors differently based on why they're coming to town. And that will help us determine what portions of their spending we want to account for. So this first type of visitor is a casual visitor. So a casual visitor is someone who is already in town for a specific reason. Maybe it's a conference or maybe they're in town for a family wedding. And while they're there, they decide they're going to attend a sporting event. So a casual visitor, for assessing economic impact, we only want to assess that event-related spending, otherwise known as incremental spending, right? Anything that they spent above and beyond what they would have spent anyway for coming to town, right? So if someone comes to town for a family wedding, they're going to pay for that hotel anyway. They're going to go out to eat anyway. But the spending that they spend at the sporting event, we can account for, and we can consider that as economic impact. But otherwise, we don't want to consider their spending. A time switcher is a visitor that was already coming to town or planning to come to town but changed their plans to be there for a specific event, right? So let's say that you have friends that live out in California. They were planning to travel to LA for Christmas, but the Dodgers and the Lakers win their championship, so they changed their plans to come to town for some of those sport-related events. Those would be time switchers, right? So those are visitors that were already planning to come spend money in those cities, but they just changed the timing of which they were going. So just like casual visitors, if we're really trying to assess the true economic impact of their spending, we only want to account for event-related spending, okay? So that would mean, again, if they were planning to come to town anyway at a different time, they would have spent money on hotel, travel, restaurants, food and beverage, all those things. So we only want to account for their event-related spending, tickets to the game, concessions, merchandise, those types of things. All right. Our last type of visitor is the visitor that we are most interested in when we are calculating economic impact for a sports team. So an incremental visitor is someone who has come to town specifically for the sporting event and would not have come otherwise. So as you can probably guess, based on our definitions of these other visitors, that would mean that we want to account for all of their spending. So that means their event-related spending and any spending that they've done within the community. So travel, taxi cabs, subway rides, hotel stays, food and beverage, shopping, really any money they've spent while they're in the community, we want to account for as part of our economic impact study because they are there because of this sporting event. So if we're gauging true economic impact of that event, those incremental visitors are the ones that are most intriguing. Okay, a little practice case for you to get some practice about the different types of visitors. So Liz, me, attended a sport business conference in Chicago last week. This is from last year. That makes me a little sad because I didn't get to go to my conference this year. Oh, COVID. But anyway, I attended a sporting business conference in Chicago. The conference was 3 days long. I spent $250 a day on hotel stay, food, and transportation. And on the last day of the conference, I decided to attend a Bulls game. The game ticket cost $100, and I spent another $80 on food and beverage at the game. That's a lot. Must have been a fun night. Okay, first question. What type of visitor am I based on this information that you have? Hopefully you said casual visitor, right? Because I came to Chicago for another reason, right? I came to Chicago for the Sport Business Conference. And then while I was there, I decided, oh, hey, might as well check out a Bulls game. So because I'm classified as a casual visitor, the portion of my spending that we'd want to account for, or the Bulls would want to account for, is just the event-related spending, right? So they would not account for this $250 a day on food, travel, and transport. That would be associated with the conference, right? They would only account for the event-related spending, which was $100 on the ticket and $80 on the food and beverage. So $180 of my spending they would account for in their economic impact analysis. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and talk about the different stages of spending, but keep in mind we will come back around to this in terms of how the team might have even gathered this data from me when they are calculating economic impact. All right, so there are essentially 3 different stages of spending that a team or a commission would want to account for when they are calculating economic impact. It's not just the direct spending that occurs at an event, which we've kind of highlighted already, but there are these other stages of spending as well that have an impact on that community. We're going to highlight the differences between these two now. Okay, so direct spending is pretty straightforward, right? This is the initial dollar that's put into a community as a result of a sporting event. Right? So that's money spent on hotel stays, that's money spent at local restaurants, that's money spent really anywhere in the community or at the event, right? Any money that's going and directly impacting a business. So how might we gather information about direct spending? How might the Bulls, for instance, have gathered information from me to find out what my spending was when I was in town? Well, the biggest tool that we have to gather this information is through a spectator survey, right? So basically, as people attend our games, our tournaments, our events, we can hand out surveys and essentially ask them to tell us about their visit in the community and the type of spending and how much they've been spending. So these spectator surveys are very common. I had a professor in undergrad who would go, he was commissioned by someone in the NFL to go to all the Super Bowls each year and hand out thousands of spectator surveys in order to gauge information from people on how they're spending their money. So this is kind of the typical information that might get gathered on a direct spending survey. So of course you want to be able to classify the visitor based on the different definitions we showed earlier. You'd also probably want to find out how many people are in their group, right? Because not everyone in the group is probably going to fill out the survey. You want to know how long they're in town so you can calculate daily spending and multiply that out. You want to know how much they're spending and on the various types of things you're trying to measure. And again, just what they're spending their money on in general. So those are some of the key pieces of information that might be gathered in a direct spending survey. So spectators obviously are a huge group that you'd focus on at a sporting event. If you're looking at an event like the marathon, the Chicago Marathon, you would do the same but for participants, right? Because an event like the Chicago Marathon is going to bring some spectators, but the bulk of the people at those events are the participants. So you can also hand out participant-based surveys to gather information. I'm just showing you an example here of an economic impact survey that might be used, and this one actually was used, I think, at an NBA game. But you can see it's kind of just a one-sheeter, right, gathering information about the individual, some demographic information, but more specifically trying to define who they are as a visitor and then asking them to specifically account for how much they've been spending within the area. And you're going to actually look at some survey data in class when we get back together on Zoom. So you'll get a chance to actually dig through some survey data like this. Okay, so we've looked at direct spending, right? That's the initial dollar going into the community as a result of a sports event. Now, there are two other stages of spending that I want us to look at here. This first one is indirect spending. So as you can see here, this is any spending that occurs as a result of that initial dollar being infused into the region. So if we were in class together, I would typically get out a $20 bill and hand it to one of you. I can't do that since we're not in person, but I would ask is, if I gave you this $20 bill, what are you going to do with it? And the answer is typically something like, I'm going to go to the bar, I'm going to go to a restaurant, I'm going to go get coffee, right? So when we think about this concept of indirect spending, we're asking what happens to that initial dollar once it's been put into the region or the community, right? So what happens is there's this ripple effect, right, that occurs where that money gets circulated after the initial investment. So here's a little chart to kind of give you an idea, right? So visitor comes into town, spends their money at a local restaurant after they attend an event, right? That money that goes to the restaurant is then paying the employees, right, or is used to tip the employee. The employee then goes and buys food at the grocery store, right? The employees and the local farmers then take that money and buy clothes at one of the stores locally. Then that retailer pays their own employees who then go shop locally at some different shops. And then the process continues. So you see that there's this ripple effect, right? Very rarely does the money get infused in a community and someone just puts it in a savings account, right? Typically it's going to travel throughout the community. It's going to have this induced effect, right, where other areas of the community are benefiting as a result of that spending. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about indirect spending, right? So you come into the community, you spend money at a restaurant, it doesn't stop there, right? It has this ripple effect on other businesses. This last stage of spending is what we call induced spending. This is a whole other level of impact from that initial influx of money. So you can see here, when you are assessing induced spending, you're looking at the effect of both that direct and indirect economic impact on earnings and employment within the region. So that initial money that came into the community now has had the chance to have a ripple effect across the different businesses and individual homes, to the point where it now has an impact on the number of full-time jobs and the wages of the people working in that community, right? So you can see that this is really getting in depth in terms of the impact of that money. Typically, what we do to assess induced spending, you might be thinking, how do we measure that? It seems complicated. Well, it is a little complicated. We typically use what's known as a multiplier, right? Which is basically just a number that helps us quantify indirect and induced spending. And thankfully, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis gathers data on economic impact in the different types of industries in the U.S., and they put out multiplier tables that basically give you or give communities and cities, an assessment of what a likely multiplier might be for a particular industry. So the multiplier itself is basically just measuring the change in output for an industry as a result of that initial dollar that gets put into the industry. Now, there are essentially three different types of multipliers that the U.S. Bureau is going to put together. There's a sales or output multiplier, which is going to estimate direct and indirect effects on spending. Income multiplier, which is going to estimate those induced effects of spending on actual household income. And then employment multiplier, it's basically just going to estimate the number of full-time jobs that were supported as a result of that spending. So like I said, there are essentially, three different tables you could go to here depending on what information you're trying to assess when you're trying to measure these different stages of spending. So we can get a little bit more clear on what this looks like. I'm going to give you a practice case here. So the city of Bloomington wants to measure the economic impact of a recent youth sports tournament that was hosted in the area. They've determined that the event brought in 5,000 visitors who spent an average of $350. They specifically want to consider the impact of spending on local businesses. Okay, so using the correct sales output multiplier from the multiplier table, calculate the total economic impact of this tournament. So we can tell from the case that we have 2 out of the 3 pieces of information we need in order to calculate economic impact, right? We have the number of visitors, which in this case is 5,000. We have average spending per visitor, which is $350. And then what we still need is the multiplier. And I told you that we have these awesome tables that can help us. Oops, I don't know why the part that I want is hiding. But essentially we can, there we go. We can look to these tables that, again, are based on a number of economic studies in these different industries. And we can see here, if we're looking for the output multiplier, we scroll down here. I'm sorry, it's cut off for some reason. But sport and recreation is a multiplier of 2.0127, right? So we pull that multiplier here. That's going to account for both the induced and indirect spending that we talked about earlier. So we add in that multiplier to our equation. We get a total economic impact of this youth sports tournament of $3.52 million. Okay, so not only have we accounted for the number of visitors, their average spending, we've also accounted for that induced and indirect spending by using this multiplier of 2.0127. And again, the data isn't necessarily perfect, but we do know that they've looked at other studies and they're gathering quite a bit of data in order to estimate this. So yes, they have to be taken with a grain of salt, right? We don't know for sure that that's the exact multiplier, but based on prior data, we can make estimates. Okay, so just to kind of summarize here, our unit here on economic impact, like I mentioned at the top, there are some issues when it comes to measuring economic impact. It can be a pretty controversial topic in our field, and I think increasingly so. I think there was a time, maybe in the 90s and early 2000s, where economic impact studies were sort of looked at as this great measure and this perfect measure. And I think in recent years, a lot of sport industry practitioners have recognized that they're not exactly perfect and that we have to kind of come to terms with that and what that means. So some of the issues here, not accounting for costs. I mentioned that when we're defining this term or this phrase, and that a lot of economic impact studies only look at spending, right? They don't actually account for costs. that went into maybe building a facility or bringing an event to town. And if you don't account for those costs, that's not necessarily a true measure of economic impact. We just looked at multipliers, and I mentioned that it's not a perfect measure. And so sometimes those multipliers end up being too high, and they're not an accurate representation of this induced and indirect spending in a community. But they're kind of our best guess at this point. Another issue in terms of kind of overestimating economic impact is that you might have some unethical folks behind the studies, right? Especially if they have a financial interest in, sharing good news with the team or with the city. There could be some unethical things happening in order to boost the numbers. So always have to consider kind of who's doing these tests and what their interest is in that situation. There's also some underaccounting that occurs or can occur in economic impact studies. It's impossible to account for all the spending that occurs surrounding a sporting event, right? You can't possibly survey everyone, and there's no way to be able to predict all of the spending that occurred if you can't talk to every individual, right? So it's impossible to account for all the spending that occurred. While those surveys are a really good tool, sometimes people don't tell the truth on them, right? They might not want to be totally honest with the spending that's occurred, or they might inflate or underinflate the spending. Sometimes people just get tired of filling out surveys, right? And they don't give you all the information. So they're not always a perfect tool, but they can be helpful. One other issue or potential issue with economic impact studies are that they don't necessarily account for future visits, right? Which you could argue long term is a key measure of economic impact, right? If someone visits your city for the first time for a sporting event and they love it and they say, hey, I'm going to bring my family back, in a few months or next year, that's a huge influx, right, in terms of new spending that wasn't going to happen if that sporting event didn't happen. So that's one thing that we can't really account for yet when it comes to measuring economic impact, but that could be a really good measure of long-term economic growth or impact from those particular sporting events. Okay, I think I covered everything I wanted to hit here in terms of economic impact. I gave you kind of an abbreviated version of this just because we have 2 topics this week. But hopefully you have a better idea of what it looks like to conduct an economic impact analysis, how we can, look at deeper levels of spending beyond just that direct spending through multipliers, and also how we can classify visitors based on why they are coming to a particular area and how that might impact how we account for their spending. All right, have a good one.